are, Maureen, Melissa, Jason Platzner, who's our communications and public relations specialist. So we'll get started right now. So actually, let's see, I'm supposed to share my screen. Are you doing that, Maureen?
Either. I can,
yeah.
Let me.
Why don't you do that? Because then I'm letting participants in, if you don't mind.
Sure. Oh, it's actually saying host disabled participant screen sharing. I guess I'm not considered a co-host, unfortunately. Maybe Jason can let the people in and.
Yeah. So
sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, so I'll do that. So you know what? Why don't what we're going to do? I'm just going to go right now and pull up the presentation.
Yep.
What we're going to do is just jump right in and let people in as they come in. I'm just going to share my screen in just a second.
Okay.
And admit at the same time a couple of things. And just 1 minute here. Okay. Let's get the right one. All right.
Perfect.
So Maureen and I are going to toggle back and forth. Obviously, Maureen is, as you know, very skilled and knowledgeable about all the components of school budgeting that are really essential to making sure that we comply every year with requirements that we're expected to comply with. And they certainly include a lot of very prescribed, steps that come from the New York State Office of Budgeting, Comptroller's Office, and so forth. So we're going to use this presentation to kind of go through some of the technical components. So there'll be some explanation about certain things that you've heard already or you know of already. And then we'll get into some of the philosophy of, where we see our budget methodology relying upon as we plan for and make this connection from this presentation to our next and final Budget 101 presentation, which is on January 14th, 2012, at the same time at 6 p.m. until 7:30 p.m. The slides, as well as the recorded Zoom session, will also be available on our website. So all of that information will be handy for anyone who wasn't or isn't able to participate in this presentation. So why don't we get started, Maureen? We'll jump right into it. Why don't you take us through that second slide, which is our infographic, which was something that we added this year.
Sure. You just want to advance to that slide.
Sure.
Okay, yeah. So this is really this graphic really just demonstrates the process of balancing the budget each year. And as we know, we have certain revenue streams, much of it coming from our local property taxes, and then funding that comes from sources such as state, federal funds, and some other smaller revenues. And just, the balance, we are required to present a balanced budget. We're not allowed to have whatever our expenses come up to really is what then, once we have our external revenues, helps us understand what that tax levy would need to be to support our given spending plan in a year. So we are in, it is a year-long process, the budgeting process, although certain times a year we speak about it as we've been doing leading up to this time, and we'll be doing for the next few months leading up to the actual budget vote in May. But it is a year-long process. It's a constant, as we do with our own household budgets, determining and projecting and understanding our spending plans. So again, just the components, just very quickly, that go into our expenses, and it is the majority of our budget. We're a people business, and that's where we spend our money, and that's in salary and benefits. It's, the largest share of our expenses, and much of that is, we have bargaining agreements, we have our staffing, so much of that is a known kind of coming in, and then we have curriculum and instruction, and that would be programs and things that would fall under there that are above just enrollment based projections. And then of course, maintaining our facilities. We, like anyone, we have heat, we have hot water, we have the preservation of the physical plan here, transportation, as well as debt service. So those are the components that go into the budget. And again, what I like about this graphic is it really demonstrates it's it's a task in trying to balance that each year as we develop the upcoming budget.
And so the intention that we had for creating this infographic is to also use it as kind of an agenda, because all the components here will be part of this presentation. So we just thought it was a good way to kind of represent, as Maureen said, that we do have to, both sides have to be even. We that's the objective, in terms of the expectation around developing the budget, the school budget, that we have to make sure that we put forth that whatever our expenses have to be covered by our revenues, and we certainly know from this past year, which we'll talk about as well as a reminder slide, how challenging that was with when we were looking for savings, and those savings in some cases were very painful for us, and so we wanted to make sure that you had this in mind as you listened to the presentation, and if you had any questions as we go through to answer those questions. And each of the presentation is divided along these lines. So you'll see, we tried to chunk the information so that it was easier, to kind of digest and manage. So on these slides, and Maureen and I will go through these. I mean, these are the challenges every year with regards to, revenues, or a source for revenues. One of the biggest, and there's probably others that can go on here, but these are, like the top 6 challenges for Hastings and for other districts in Westchester. There's a perception that, Hastings is a wealthy district and it has sufficient resources. And yeah, there is a great deal of wealth here, but the vast majority of the source of funding of our schools come from the taxpayers. And so, and there's, not a lot of commercial property that becomes a source for additional, tax that, can contribute to the school district. So that's always a major, challenge. You want to do the next one, Maureen?
Sure. Again, I think since the inception of the tax cap and, people understanding it, there's a fear to exceed that. So in developing a budget, pre-tax cap, you really developed your budget based on needs, and what the shift has been is that people figure out what the tax cap is and then fit their budget into that, with the fear that in exceeding that would either get your budget voted down. So again, that's somewhat of a newer phenomenon as the tax cap has come into play here in New York State.
And in terms of the limited ability to generate new revenue, as I said, new revenue would come from properties or new commercial properties, brought to the school district. And, everyone knows, what's downtown and what Hastings draws from. And there are no large commercial entities that, we can, expect to see any new revenue from. So that really is, that will always be a challenge for us, because the community has, certainly some expectations around, what the waterfront looks like, and, and whether or not, what should be there, and if anything, and, what's really important about, maintaining the beauty of the waterfront. So that certainly, the notion of new revenue is really very much tied to what the community would, would tolerate in terms of, other entities that could generate tax income, which would then come to the school districts, the school district. You can do the next one.
Sure. So it's another, big factor, and this is something we are mindful of each year, changes from Albany that impact existing revenue levels. So in addition to just worrying about keeping what we've at least, hoping we receive, I'll just kind of just throw an example of what this can mean. There's changes in existing formulas. So the way we receive our state aid is based upon a formula derived by the state. And any change to that formula that could, either a percentage could then, in fact, mean that there'd be less money available to us. And as Valerie had just touched on earlier, the well factor is a part of state funding, and depending upon how that is, when they create their state spending plan, we always have to be very watchful of different shifts of either expenses or items that they're recommending to either shift to the district. So as an example, there's a proposal, and Valerie and I had spoke about this the other day, and it actually did start this year, where children in residential placements, where there was a sharing amongst the state, the county, and the local school district in some of those costs have slowly been shifted to school districts entirely. So although it may sometimes not be obvious, that's an example of a shift in a revenue level from the state that would impact us negatively. So just, that's, and there are many things like that occur each year. So again, then we start off behind, we already start off now with less. So again, those are kind of changes that, impact our ability to balance our budget.
And then, of course, public engagement and advocacy is really critical when it comes to, making the case, for what in the long term that means to a school district that wants to, in a community that wants to make sure it maintains the, integrity of the school system, that those, that reductions don't end up, changing, class sizes or increasing class sizes and, reducing programs that are really valuable, and that, it's so important to consider, as in the first slide that we presented, that the balance of revenues and what comes from our taxpayers, will not always, match what our expenses are, every year, and expenses, do, accrue every year. So that's sort of the nature of a service industry, where you have employees and contracts and benefits and so forth, that there's in retirement plans to contribute to. It's really tough to not see those costs, grow every year. And that's every school system, every public school system, all over the state and the country. And it's really a matter of just helping, that one of the challenges is getting past, that notion that we're stuck to the tax cap, that is somehow, cemented and can't change. But at the same time, it doesn't contribute to, the importance of making sure, through, public engagement and advocacy, that we're looking for, ways in which we can, look at the long-term picture of maintaining the schools and start, considering some other ways in which we could think about, the tolerance of, what additional amount is needed every year, and then, how do we ensure that the narrative associated with that is really clear to the constituents. And an advocacy in terms of, unfunded mandates and the kinds of things that school districts have to deal with every year, does require, that the public engages with its local officials and others. So whenever there's outreach for, people to contact their local legislators, that it's so important to do that. It's so important for, Albany and others to hear from the taxpayers that, there needs to be, we need to have a moratorium on, unfunded mandates, and that, every year the school districts are asked to absorb something that is no longer being provided for, at the state level, at the level of the state ed department, as well as the governor's office. So that's so important always, and certainly it contributes to the last item, which is the notion that every year we want to not only maintain the programs, we want to add and be able to make sure that we increase or provide for other options for our students, other courses, or other forms of professional learning supports and programs to grow our school district. And it's limited if there are very few revenue sources to ensure that there's a pipeline to keep that moving forward, because it does require some expenditures. If we're trying to grow our special education programs to make them attractive to others in other districts, we have to make sure that we're providing professional learning to the professionals who are providing the services to our children and to children coming in from other districts. And so that requires an expenditure to grow those programs, and sometimes those are not things that we can do. So it's really vital and important that we are able to every year build upon, so that we can attract new sources of revenue. Maureen?
Yes, so this is, Valerie had touched on this earlier, but again, as we're just focusing on our revenue side of the budget equation, and this is not something new in Hastings, but this is something just to kind of highlight. We believe revenue is the problem, not the spending, and the reason we say that is, again, just to remind that the limited commercial tax base in Hastings does make it, particularly on a small district, then shifts the burden completely onto the homeowners, to bear the brunt of the budget. But it also makes it challenging because I'll just give an example of a local school district, and we could just, go up to one of our neighbors in the river towns in Irvington, which, although very similar sized in terms of student enrollment, has a much larger commercial base. And because of that, their budget also, because it's not falling completely on taxpayers, they have a much higher amount of spending, but the equivalent tax rate to their homeowners is much lower. So sometimes I think when people thinking of because they're looking at their property taxes, and we understand that, but it's really not so much as that our spending is out of control, but really having a very limited tax base really does place the burden on our homeowners. So that's always going to put a lot of restraints on us, and in particular, as we've spoken about, that coupled with the tax cap constraints that we've been the last few years, trying to adhere to, it is really now becoming a very difficult balancing act. And then the last point just here, again, other similarly sized Westchester school districts have much higher per pupil spending. And again, just to kind of go back to when we look at the school districts that we're often compared to, not necessarily that we have to compare ourselves to, in terms of student enrollment and both performance indicators and programmatic kind of things. When we look at some of our neighbors and we'll go, why are they able to have that? It's because they have a much larger tax base, which also allows them to have a much larger spending plan. So, we have stayed mindful of that, but there's a point in which, you do start to lose things because of that. So again, sorry, Valerie, this is just a quick graphic breakdown. We've spoken a lot about this, about, how the property taxes in our community, and similar to most of Westchester, is the largest chunk of our revenue picture, with very small amount coming from the state. And again, this represents really our 2021 budget, and that was our state aid, the percentage of our budget. We were projecting that to be, it's usually hovers around 10%. So it was a little bit less this year based upon what the anticipated shortfall of the state. And again, the rest comes, as you can see, from our appropriated balance, which is any monies we have left that we reappropriate to the budget, and then some miscellaneous receipts, sales tax, and things. And the one thing I just wanted to mention about this infographic, in Westchester County, most schools look similar to our graph here, But in upstate New York, this graph is completely the opposite because a lot of upstate school districts are about 70% funded by the state. Now, it is because of wealth factors and things like that. But as Valerie had mentioned, the advocacy cannot, we need to really understand that that is a big, piece of the way the state funds districts. It really just is. And because there's so many needy districts in New York State, we do have to fight for every dollar. So it is important that that we are always trying to get every dollar that we can into the district.
And in terms of this this particular slide, we reviewed this, last year, and of course, Maureen goes, into discussion of our state aid, revenue, and 8.6% is fairly small, and I think it does put into sort of perspective how much Hastings depends upon the taxpayers to close our schools. I mean, to develop a school budget, and the state aid, again, is based upon wealth and the demographics of the community, and it's really no small point that this region sends a lot of money to Albany, but certainly doesn't get nearly as much back. And and that is because there's this thinking that there's not need here, that families are going to be able to every year pay the taxes and keep our schools operating certainly at a level at which it continues to attract more homeowners to the region and continue to build the value of the school district. We do get, sources of revenue from BOCES, but, to participate in a BOCES service agreement, we do have to spend, and then that revenue comes back. And of course, is a tremendous savings to school districts that don't have to engage in single contracts with vendors that would make it almost cost prohibitive to even do so because of the expenses. So having multiple districts across Westchester participate in certain service agreements together reduces those services to us fairly significantly. And depending on the service, it could be, as much as, 50% or 60% reimbursement, which means we pay a service fee, but at the end of the year, since, under the state Constitution, the BOCES cannot, keep any of the, the revenue that they receive over the course of the year. That has to be given back to the school districts. Then we do get those resources back. So that is a form of revenue, but we do have to participate. We sort of like have to pay to play with, with regards to that particular example. And as we alluded to earlier, we do receive tuitions from some districts that do value some of the programs that we have, especially at Hillside. So in order to continue to make those programs attractive, we do have to spend to make sure that we provide ample amount of professional learning for everyone, so that our educators, our teacher assistants, aides and monitors, administrators, everyone who's associated with those classrooms have the tools they need to work effectively and successfully with those learners. And while we like to add tuition as a source of revenue every year, that's a year-to-year commitment from those districts. They don't have to even be with us for the year. Something could happen. A child could move to another school district, and that's no longer revenue that we can count on. So that's so important. And in terms of building aid, and Maureen, you want to talk about that since we have some contemporary kinds of examples?
Yeah, sure. So again, the state aid, although the majority of our funding comes through what is called the foundation aid, but as Valerie was mentioning, there are other aid drivers of aid in a district, and one of them, and we've spoken a lot about it as we've discussed our current bond projects, is we do receive a certain percentage back on our capital spending from the state. So again, it's an example also of state funding that actually is a positive example, because there's I guess it's an investment to ensure that the infrastructure of New York schools continue to invest in that. And because of that, the state does partner. And in our situation, our aid ratio is 42.4%. So as we spend money, similar to the BOCES, it does obviously require an expenditure, but it is something that either we would need to spend money on anyway. So, the fact that we do get that partnership and that reimbursement back from the state in the following year is a benefit to us in terms of maintaining our facilities, as well as provides a revenue source that comes back in the following year. So many like other aids here, there are some that there's in the state aid formula, some aids are driven by expenditures. So that is explained here on the slide. And then the only one other piece I wanted to mention on this slide is that and as Valerie had mentioned, the state aid formula is based on demographics. It takes into consideration what people's incomes are in the town, and another large driver that is property wealth. And as we know in Westchester County, because of the proximity, in particular in New York City, because of that, the home values are much higher than other parts of the state. But the one piece that the formula really doesn't give enough consideration to is the cost of living in the area. So although obviously the property wealth as well as folks' incomes in this area are much higher than other parts of the state, unfortunately the cost of living is not that's the part of the state aid formula that doesn't properly address that because of the fact that it's weighted so heavily on those other two factors. So that's why we have a challenge in it. And then the last bullet on this, and again, it was the glory days, but we're not going to ever see that type of funding again. There was a time that we were receiving 30% of all of our revenues for the school district from the state of New York. So over time, it diminished each year, and similar to the slide, that's something we're always very mindful of too. Whatever revenues we are receiving, we absolutely do not want that to decrease any further. It's important funding. This is.
Go ahead, Maureen.
Oh, sure. I'm sorry. Yeah. Again, this is just these are kind of description slides, so they're really just for reference points when people, if they want to go back and look at our slides here. So just for when we talk about different things, tax levy really speaks to the amount of money that's the dollars generated in property taxes. So that's what that term means. And that's about 85% of our school budget. Hastings, as we mentioned before, greatest source of our school funding comes from that, and also similar to all other districts of Westchester.
Go right ahead.
Sure. So Valerie had talked about, kind of highlighted some of these other revenue sources, and although they only represent 2.3% of our total revenues, also extremely important, extremely any loss in these revenues, we feel it. So the largest of those other revenues is local sales tax, and that is still about somewhere between the $500,000 to $600,000 range, depending on the year. As many know, the local Westchester sales tax was increased last year, and that actually has been very helpful because although the first quarter, because of the pandemic, with many stores closing over the summer, our receipts were lower. It has rebounded a bit, and then coupled with the higher rate. So again, that's very important funding. Even if you think about it, even if we lose 20% or 10% of that revenue, that's a teaching position. So again, all of our dollars are critically important to ensuring we can balance our budget. We do get some federal grant money, and although again, not as much as many other school districts receive, all the dollars whatever dollars that they are, and this year between some special ed and some title grants, that could be close to 300,000 when you combine the two. Again, critically important, and any reduction of those means we have to reduce spending. Interest income, just money on the dollars we have. We are limited to what we can invest in, and then as Valerie mentioned, the tuition, which again, we can't become overly reliant on it, but it has been a nice source of income for us, and really it does pay for things, right? So we're running the programs for our students anyway. We're not running it to be a private school, but certainly attracting and maintaining those programs, have been very helpful to us on the revenue side of things. And again, we do for some some outside organizations that use our facilities, we do receive some facilities usage fees from that as well. And again, all money goes back to supporting our expenditure side of the budget.
And in terms of some of the implications when revenues are not available or they're reduced, and that I think we saw that, we still see that, we're still in that, environment. Last year, we were anticipating some COVID expenses, but, what we certainly, were, shocked by was, the notion that, of course, this pandemic had, basically, just massacred, the state, the state's major source of revenue, which comes from, taxes, that, come from businesses that, were in hiatus for a while due to the sort of the worst part of, the pandemic in the spring. And now we've re-entered that since the governor's order has also, certainly in New York City, closed in restaurant, indoor dining. And so, that's still, that's something that's going to be with us for a while. So while we were prepared, and with our, our best thinking that we would have to, budget for some COVID expenses, we certainly didn't know the extent of them. Given, what we were doing, back in February, March of 2019, of this school year, we certainly didn't have the knowledge that we have now of what's needed. The governor, told us about these and told us when it would happen, that we would have these reductions and, assessments that would be reduced from our state aid, which was, really a frightening thought. And, and the state continues to project downward the amount of revenue that it expects. And certainly, one of the things that would be important for the school districts would be to, those especially, and I think all of them have, spent far more than they ever thought they'd be spending on COVID expenses. And, there is no aid coming to, we didn't receive any to really, cover and address those expenses that were really essential and necessary for us to reopen as safely as we did, hire additional staff that we certainly, again, didn't fully comprehend, back in February of the school, of the beginning of this year, to anticipate, what to expect. All of the cleaning and all of the staff needed to make sure that we maintain social distancing and manage, the flow of individuals and children, and, leave request and the additional substitutes or leave replacement teachers. All of that was really, surprising expenditures that, we hadn't planned for. And so we still anticipate going into the school year, now that we know that children under 16 will not be vaccinated, we still will have to have in place the precautions that we've been taking for adults and faculty, staff, and our students with regards to, the cleanliness, through the, addition of cleaners and custodial staff, the additional monitors, teacher aides, and teacher assistants to make sure that we, continuously, adhere to practices of social distancing. And mask wearing is still very important. So there will be a need to add in some COVID expenses for the 2021-2022 school year budget, and and we'll do our best to to determine what those things are. But don't be surprised when you do see those. And again, it's because, by the time, the vaccine is available for school people, and you've kind of seen, you've seen that graphic that the New York Times provided. You can plug in, information that will show you where you are in the line. And when I last looked, we were way behind, in terms of the line of people who are, would be up for, getting the vaccine. And then, so all of that, that all of those sort of efforts, will still be running parallel to when schools reopen in the new school year. And so we do have to make sure that we're working on, being prepared for that in this upcoming budget. And any money that we receive, that we hope we receive, certainly will help us in the long run.
Right. And then speaking about COVID on the revenue side of things, as Valerie had mentioned, there's still, quite a bit unknowns. I think the state, I think you'll kind of understand that the state revenues are down both in, for all the different types of revenues they've received, that we understand that with the, in particular in New York City and the loss of revenues there's a large impact throughout the state. So, we're still hoping that the federal government will provide some relief to states. But as of right now, we did budget for the reduction based upon, of course, the actual revenues that the state is receiving, and that how that would impact us. So again, just seeing when there's a downturn and how quickly any loss of revenue and what we would need to do. And this is just to remind, of some of the reductions that were needed. And again, if there is a restoration, let's hope, of state aid, we do still have to balance that with understanding we will have some additional expenses as heading into next year. But just as a recap, these many of these reductions were based upon this projected loss of revenues from the state and local revenues such as sales tax. So, we did reduce or eliminate the FLES program at Hillside. We reduced a section of second grade that was existing, and we cut that back to 5. We reduced an incoming 7 sections of 4th grade to the 5th grade. We brought it back down to 6. We reduced, I think actually it ended up being more than 1 teacher aide position, a reduction of math coach at FMS, 0.6 FT in science at the high school, some AOK offerings at the middle, and art electives at primarily at the high school, reduction of supplies, contractual services, and equipment district-wide, reduction in PD, particularly Gravity Goldberg, and also other PD lines were reduced, reduction in some of our transportation services. We did reduce some of our co-curricular and sports spending. And there were some others, but those are kind of the high, major kind of reductions we did make. And that was really because, and again, it's still unknown as we sit here today in December, understanding fully what we'll end up with from the state this year. And a lot of it is they're depending on, how much they'll get from the federal government. So we did, in order to balance our budget, make these reductions with the uncertainty of state and local revenues. And then again, as Valerie had mentioned, also the unknown of the COVID-related expenses needed to be considered as well when we were planning, because they're real and they do cost money. So, unfortunately, we did have to reduce staff, and we did, spend a lot of money on just being able to open our buildings in terms of PPE and all the other items that we did need to purchase for that.
And so that's a fairly large amount, almost $1 million that, had to come out of the budget, through a focus on, existing, programs and services. And so, you can only imagine that if that was the sole strategy, every year, we would really decimate, the system with those kinds of reductions. If the only methodology for balancing the school budget, given that, we only have so many revenue sources, because of the wealth and the demographics of Hastings and similar districts, any revenue coming from the state will go to those districts of greater need. And then, the fact that, we're in a service industry and there are going to be, increases in contracts and benefits and, other obligations that we are beholden to, there is always going to be this imbalance. So that scale we showed you earlier is always going to be imbalanced. And the way to balance it, unfortunately, from our, this current school year was to make those, almost $1 million worth of reductions. And as I said, that is, not sustainable. And so, if there's something, that we really want you to remember, it would be, this is the sole methodology that we've used so far. And as we, look at the next set of slides and go into our January 14th Budget 101 presentation, we will be talking about, as I said, the sustainability of this approach. In this next section, Maureen's going to take you through is on fund balance.
So this is again another on our pie chart, another source of our revenues when we're balancing our budget. And again, we'll as part of the Budget 101s, we're also explaining the terminology. So as we go into our budget presentations, you'll be familiar with where those funds come from, and what that represents in our budget. So the appropriated fund balance is the amount of funds that's earmarked to offset the tax levy in any given year. And again, this is not always a defined amount, and it's not always available either. The appropriated amount is generated by the previous year's budget, and really it's the difference between what our actual revenues ended up being at the end of the fiscal year over the actual expenditures, and that's where the district either understands that they have appropriated fund balance. So our current appropriated fund balance for the 2021 school year, we appropriated 1.6 million, almost 1.7 million. That was monies that again was generated from the 1920 operating year. And we were able to use those savings and expenditures and additional revenues to come in as a source of revenue to offset our current spending budget. Again, it is a unique amount, and it really depends on your operational costs. Each year, you could have a situation in which the amount could be a little bit more, but you could also have a situation where it could be, a little bit less, significantly less. It really depends on what happens in each individual school year. And again, we are in a service industry. We serve children and their needs, and depending on any given year, that amount can change. And again, just a reminder, the appropriated fund balance is not a recurring revenue. It's important just to remember that and be very cautious as we budget, not to become overly reliant on it, because if we have a year in which we're unable to generate a certain amount, that actually creates like a hole in our revenues that needs to be made up from either expenditure reductions or increasing our tax levy to make up that loss. So, but again, we'll be using these terms throughout our budget presentation. So that is what appropriated fund balance speaks to. Tax cap and tax levy, another items that we speak to frequently. Do you want me to take that, Valerie?
Yeah. I think, I'll just sort of, start with like a little preamble.
Sure.
So, tax, the tax cap is a philosophy, has been in place, it's been renewed, and, it's probably going to stay, because philosophically, prior to, 2019 and 2011, those were days when, there were, sometimes double digit, increases, that, were associated with, decisions made in school districts with regards to, operations and programs and contracts. And so philosophically, it makes sense. But realistically, when you look at, when we are confined to how much more we can levy, then it really does sort of, draw into focus the reason why almost $1 million is needed to balance the school budget. Because if you can only, collect so much revenue from the taxpayers, and we have, the limited numbers, the limited sources of revenue that can be generated, you really do this notion of a tax cap really does have to be something that our district thinks about from the standpoint of, the public has been conditioned to think about the tax cap as something that's set. But what you don't know in this tax cap, or what we don't talk about in the tax cap, is the impact on the system if your methodology for closing the budget is to make reductions, $1 million worth of reductions. And one of the things that one of the sort of pictures we want to paint is, how we have to start looking at, other methodologies that don't include only one source for balancing the budget. And so Maureen will talk about, tax cap and the tax levy, a little further.
Sure. Yeah. So thank you, Valerie, for that. So again, just in terms of speaking, what does a tax cap? And many of you may be familiar with it, but just to remind everyone, the tax cap was came out of a legislation, and it's been with us. It was enacted in 2011. The first fiscal year that was impacted by that legislation was 12-13. The tax cap, what it really speaks to, it places a restriction on the amount of dollars a district can levy additionally each year, and it's there's a formula, and we'll show you a slide that kind of just walks through the different components of it. But it is mostly tied to CPI, and the CPI can never be above 2% in any given year. So the one thing that is many districts and many people were understanding why the tax cap was valid. I said there was a time in which, increases, and I think it was a way to put some controls, the feeling that many people, especially in our state of New York, feel that the taxes or people felt burdened by them. But it also then put this very kind of, well, first of all, very arbitrary kind of, although tied to CPI, it really doesn't take into account school districts are not businesses. They are businesses, but they're a people business. So unlike a maybe a business that manufactures something, it's not so easy to, we don't close our doors to people. And the tax cap really doesn't take into account that there are different needs that exist that are driven by children and individuals, and not as easy to just use a percentage of the CPI and develop a budget around that. And the other piece that is also very challenging is that when the tax cap legislation was created, it also did require, in order for districts to exceed that cap, it did require a 60% supermajority. So and then the reason I mentioned that, I think that's where I think at the beginning we spoke about that fear around districts not wanting to exceed it, because it really, most votes you just have to get one extra, right? One over the 50% plus one person over 50% margin. And in this situation, you actually need what is called, is referred to as a supermajority. So I think because of that, there's been a reluctance although there are districts that did need to sooner than others exceed that cap because of the fear of a budget going down. But as time has gone on, it's become much harder for districts to stay under the cap, and without really either reducing program or reducing staffing or different things. So for us, it would require as it did last year, reductions in order, because last year was also tied to what we anticipated as a reduction in revenues, but it was also partially due to the calculation of this tax cap last year, because it is difficult. And again, this is just a quick spreadsheet, and just kind of shows you what goes into figuring out what your individual tax cap is each year, tax caps individual to a district in terms of some factors. So it is, you do start with your previous tax levy. And again, that's the dollars associated with the property taxes revenue portion of your budget. You multiply that by a individual growth factor that is unique to the district. And that growth factor is based on real assessed valuation of the individual school district. And in this upcoming year, it is much lower than it has been the 3 previous years. So that is a very small, gives us a little bit of extra dollars in that calculation. You have some local pilots and capital exclusions that have to be added in and taken out. Then that kind of, that plus the CPI, which right now we're projecting to be 1.5%. I'm not projecting it, that is what it currently is, but we anticipate the tax cap limit to be at that rate this year, which again is not 2%, it's less than 2%, and even 2% is difficult to live under, but certainly anything less than that's even more so. Just using that formula, it shows that currently we're projecting that limit to limit our levy growth next year. And again, it may be slightly different once the final tax cap, but it'll be right in around this amount, about $815,000 of additional taxes. And again, we'll speak to a little bit later budget growth. And again, that'll be, we'll be unpacking this a lot more in our budget presentations and for future budget 101s. Although $815,000 is a good amount of money, when you really think about it on the totality of our budget, and many of our expenses that increased by significantly above the CPI, it is extremely challenging. And again, we'll unpack that further, and you'll see why it is very does not really allow without making reductions to stay under that cap.
And then this is just a summary page for you to
Yep.
go back to of
Yep.
what we just talked about, and keeping in mind the differences between the two, the cap being what's allowable under New York state law, and the tax levy being what's available to raise from their tax sources to support the school district. Go right ahead, Maureen.
Okay, tax cap limit. Again, I just mentioned this when I was walking through the formula. When the tax cap, the inception of the tax cap, a lot of people thought of it as, oh, well, you either your budget's going up 2% each year, and it's not always 2%, as we mentioned, and it's not on the total budget either. It's really just it's on the portion of your tax levy, which is not even your total spending. So really, in order even to have a tax levy at 2% or less, your budget to budget actually has to be less than that, because the budget to budget is your total spend. So those don't even line up. But just since the inception of the tax cap, only 5 times has it actually been 2%. Our individual cap, as I had mentioned, is unique to the district, and it has ranged from 1.129 to a high of 6.29, although we didn't levy 6.29 that year. And that was mostly due to an increase in our overall assessed valuation in the town that one particular year. Hastings has not exceeded the tax cap since its inception. And actually, not only have we exceeded it, in many years, we did not levy up to the allowable cap. So kind of when we didn't need to, in the years such as when we had the higher levies or the higher cap, I mean, there was, there was a time in which, although sometimes you go back and say, maybe we should have levied a little bit more, but we have really tried just to levy what we need in any given year. But as time has gone on, and as that, especially in particular this upcoming year, similar to last year where the amount was less than 2%, the actual CPI, it becomes more challenging over time, over the course of time to adhere to that tax cap limit without really making some reductions in spending.
And these are pretty much summary points, so go right ahead.
Yes. Again, it's just good to reflect on, this is, I could probably put up some more bullet points here, but why is the tax cap so challenging? It is, as I mentioned, and we'll be speaking about this throughout budget presentations, it's tied to the levy, not to your overall increase in the budget. And as we get into more of our budget presentations, that'll be very clear, why that's a challenge. The tax cap does not take into account that most expenses are increasing significantly higher than CPI. Certain things increase by CPI, but not health insurance. So different expenses that we have, they typically exceed CPI sometimes by double. Our salary schedules, which are, as we mentioned, we're a people business. Most of our money is invested in our staff, and the salary schedules that were established, and again, not unique to Hastings, in all teacher contracts throughout the state, and many other states are structured in this fashion. This was before the tax cap came into existence. So, many of their increases year over year already are exceeding the CPI because they were not tied to the CPI, nor are they even in the tax cap, that we live in. So these were already in existence prior to that. So, we are required to pay that. So just to kind of give you a sense that, again, our expenses are exceeding that tax cap in many instances. And again, one of the things we alluded to, we are a people business. Individual student needs are not factored into a tax cap formula. Just as an example, and it could be any child's needs that need to be addressed, but if a child with an IEP requires a specialized placement, that's different from either the previous year or they're new to the district, that expense needs to be absorbed within that tax cap. So although there may be an increase of expenses there, that there's no acknowledgement of that. And again, sometimes even if our enrollment is not growing as a total district by a tremendous amount, the needs of the children, they're not an exception to the tax cap. And in order to sometimes address different needs, we need to shift dollars or make reductions elsewhere to fill that gap. Again, unanticipated expenses, again, are not an exclusion to the tax cap. So we do need to factor, if it happens, we just need to be able to either, as Valerie said, we've been doing that by making reductions elsewhere to balance those expenses, similar to the COVID.
And the other thing I know that you alluded to, Maureen, was this notion that tax cap. Another challenge is the fact that, the tax cap does not, factor in the available revenue that you have, to use, to close your gap. So it doesn't look at, communities on the basis of how much commercial property, is available or not, and that's a huge, I see disadvantage, in communities, the ones that do have, naturally lots of businesses and, they have a lot of commercial development, and that brings in a lot of additional revenue to the, to those school districts. And for others that don't have that commercial development and other sources of revenue, that, that does, impact the school budget, and it does impact, the burden that lives with the taxpayers. So, it is something to think about, because it is a philosophy that, will lead to, us having to, as I said, come up with some other, another methodology for, maintaining the programs, keeping the programs and the courses attractive, so that we're not cutting things that the community values, or having to make those tough decisions because there's, nothing that's left that can be cut that won't have a detrimental effect on the overall operations of the program K-12 or programs K-12. So it's a really serious component of overall budget development that, that does drive decisions about other things that really matter in the school system. And this tax levy planning is certainly one of the important parts of our presentation in terms of us leading up to the next Budget 101 that Maureen will talk about, because we do have to consider, what is that level at which the community will tolerate, a percentage or a half a percentage above the tax cap, so that we don't have to, rely upon reductions to courses and programs and services, which means, staff. That's the only thing that's our largest, expenditure is, around, the individuals that are necessary and professionals that are necessary in our school system to provide instruction and to operate the system. So in order to, when we do have to think about and look at reductions, it does, it's in our best interest to consider other ways to not, rely upon that, as the sole methodology, because it will make a long-term detrimental, will have long-term detrimental impact on our school district, but it will also impact the attractiveness of this investment. I mean, investing in the schools, this is an asset. These properties are valuable. The services and the quality of instruction and the educational programs do attract, other homeowners or prospective homeowners to the region. So it is absolutely necessary that we think about maintaining that. Maureen?
Yes. So again, this is just, this is based on very preliminary numbers, and this does not take into account restorations of positions or increases due to enrollment. So if, again, just using a rollover budget scenario, and when I say rollover, because again, we do zero-based budgeting, but for demonstration purposes, even if we were to kind of, all the cuts we took last year, we said, we're going to live with them, and we're just going to, go into next year. And of course, we have increases of many of our expenses driven year over year, just to open our doors again. So, currently just rolling over without having all the actual program requests finalized. An example of that would be that even in that scenario, adding nothing back, there could be increases elsewhere. We would need to reduce about $500,000 with that tax cap formula that we showed. So, and from our current budget, just to adhere to the tax cap. So, and again, this is also estimating that we are going to have a restoration of aid, just to kind of show you the impact of that. But again, so just to understand that, so $450,000, as many of you know who were part of our budget process last year, that's 3-4 positions. It's significant. $450,000 dollars of reductions is 100,000 is actually very significant. It's all the things, even when we talked about cutting some smaller Schedule Bs, we saw the significance and the impact to children in proposing some of those. So, currently that's just an example of what just in a rollover scenario, what would be required to be reduced further. And then again, but as Valerie mentioned, that's to adhere to that tax cap formula that we kind of went over with you. And then, what would it be if you went 1% over that? What would that look like? And that would more or less allow us not to make any reductions. So, and just to kind of give you a sense of what does that 1% mean to individuals? If for an individual tax, our average homeowner assessed valuation, according to the town of Greenberg that provides this to us, is $840,000. So, depending on how much your home is worth, if it's a little bit more, a little bit less, that amount would change. But if we were to be able to go 1% over the tax cap, which would pretty much in that scenario close that budget gap, it would cost that individual homeowner $178 additional taxes a year. And although we are always very mindful of any addition of taxes to our residents, thinking about the impact of that 1% on our school budget when we're talking about 4 positions or full-time programmatic type positions that would have to be reduced to close that gap, kind of gives you of why districts start to think and propose and look at when they're, particularly if they would need to reduce expenditures, what is the tolerance, how much should we propose to exceed the tax cap, and why would you do it? And it's just to start thinking about that, because that's what districts start to do. They start to look at, what the impact is of those dollars in terms of programming versus, what the increase to individual homeowners are. And I think many districts have had to do this already, and others are considering doing it for this upcoming year as well. Thinking about what would make sense in terms of closing budget deficits.
Now we'll get into 5-year expenditure and revenue projections, which will get us to very close to the end of our presentation, where we'll have opportunity to answer questions.
Sure.
Thank you, Maureen.
Yes. So we're going to unpack this further later. This is just to kind of demonstrate, and we would need another meeting just to kind of focus on this, but just to kind of give you a sense of budgets. And when you look at a spending plan of $50 million, and I had spoken earlier about $800,000 on the tax cap seems like it is a good amount of money, but just saying when you look at our expenditures year over year, and even when we take an approach of what I would consider somewhere in the middle of what our budget would increase, which is at that medium level. We're saying if our projected expenditures were to increase at 3.5% to 4% in a given year, what is the increase in that budget? And if you look at our existing budgets, $51,660,000. And if our expenditures go up, again, without anything changing, anything being added back, go up between 3% and 4%. And that's basically because we have salary and other obligations, pensions and health insurance and, our other items. And we'll get into that when we unpack our budget. But just as an example here, that would require another $2 million of spending. And again, this is not adding, this is just maintaining, and again, shows that, although $800,000 seems like a lot, but when you look at what it means on a $51 million, $52 million, budget, even if we only increase our budget by less than 3%, we would still need $1.6 million of additional revenues to balance our budget. And as you look at it, and we are required to, we've always done 5-year budget planning, but it is also a requirement. And again, it is difficult for a school district. We do project it based upon our current enrollments and current staffing, but as we all know, things change each year. So, this is just basically taking what we have now and projecting out what the cost will be to maintain what we currently have next year. And you see that in this example, it's about $2 million. That's fine. We can go to the next one just for the next term. Now, when we look at this, is now looking at our revenue side of the budget and saying, okay, we know that looking at that, kind of baseline projection of expenditures in order to maintain what we just currently have here, if nothing were to really change all that much, and knowing our employee obligations going into next year, more or less, we would need another $2 million of monies to balance that. So in looking at the allowable tax rate, this is like a slightly different, because this is a slightly different model, but in this example, it actually shows that if our taxes were to go up by 875, which is a little bit more than even our current levy is, we would currently still have a shortfall of about $475,000 in revenue. And again, this is actually projecting a restoration of state aid and a restoration of some of our sales tax and some of those things that we took reductions in last year. So that's actually sort of an optimistic look at revenues, and it is still showing a shortfall of close to $500,000, which would need to be cut to adhere or stay under the tax cap as we think. Well, we're pretty confident that that's where the rate is going to be. So, that's where we start our budget process. And I think we've, spoken about, restorations of things and just the difficulty in doing that and in trying to stay under a tax cap. It's impossible, quite frankly. Again, we are hopeful and optimistic we'll be seeing, our other non-tax revenues coming up. But even with that, being that they are not the largest portion of our budget, is really driven on those property taxes. Not having that amount even go up by 2%, it makes it impossible to balance a budget without looking at reduction. So, and again, it only gets worse as you project that out further. And again, we can get much more into that as we really get into our budget process this year. But as that tax cap, that starting tax cap is, tax levy, the smaller it is, the more the issue becomes exacerbated over the course of time. And, one of the items also that we do have to consider, and I mentioned it earlier, that appropriated fund balance, which again, is not always going to be with us. And this graph here really demonstrates that as the ability, or as our revenues and expenditures get tighter our year over year, if we don't have that money, that's another area of revenue that if that reduces, if we don't want to exceed the tax cap, we have to reduce expenditures to balance that budget. So, it just kind of shows the difficulty of, and what we really experienced last year was in trying to adhere to the tax cap, and with having any type of thought of any of our other revenues reducing, it required us to make those cuts. So that's kind of to demonstrate that fund balance.
Yeah, and these last few slides that we have on fund balance and revenue planning.
Yeah, yep, and we'll go through these pretty quickly. Again, fund balance, we talked about appropriated balance. We've also, and we always talk about it while we're discussing our budget, we talk about our fund balance and reserves, right? So what is fund balance? Fund balance, again, by definition, again, as it's always just good to have these as a reference point. It's the district savings account, for lack of better words. Fund balance is generated over time, and is the difference, more or less, is generated by revenues over expenditures when we receive additional revenues to what we anticipated. Why is it important for any district to have fund balance? In order to address potential shortfalls in revenues in any given budget year, as well as unexpected expenses. It's important to keep a reasonable amount of fund balance. Reserves, we speak a lot about them. We'll continue to speak a lot about them. Reserves are also our savings plans, and they're mechanisms for accumulating cash for future needs. Some of which, as an example, are capital outlays and other allowable purposes that are prescribed by New York State law. The practice of planning ahead and systematically saving for items that we know that we're going to have expenses is financially prudent, and it also helps us have money for contingencies that may come up over the course of time. Most reserve funds are established to provide resources for very intended future use, and they're pretty restrictive. So it's not as though we can just kind of create them and not have some real basis for doing so. And also we're limited to funding those based upon actual needs. They are used to help mitigate the financial impact of a major or non-recurring or unforeseen expenditure on your annual operating budget. And establishing them is essential for providing, we have to have clear purpose for them, but it also helps us smooth our budget, because by having some funds available for unforeseen items, then you don't have to budget for those. So it allows to have that savings account. Reserves are funded similar to that fund balance. They're most of the time the funds come there by the unexpected balances of existing appropriations or surplus money and transfers. This is just a current snapshot of our existing reserves and fund balances. And again, this is from we show this every year, and it kind of shows we have obviously the history way before that as well, but shows in 2017 we had reserves and fund balances in the district that totaled $10 million. I know sometimes people think it's a lot. Much of it, and again, we can on a different night where we want to allow for questions and answers tonight, but much of it is restricted for particular uses. And as we see over the course of time, that in particular, if you just look at the first line there, it was for tax surcharge refunds, which are real liabilities that the district continues to have, and is actually far more than what is in reserve. But as you can see, in one given year, we paid out 1.1 million in a year over year. So it is necessary to have it, because it's a real expense. And when we have that liability given to us, we have to pay it. So you do need to have funds available for that. But as you see, over time, with diminishing revenues and increasing expenses, we also see now this other impact on our reserves. We're projecting to have less than we did have the previous year, and actually much less than we had 5 years ago. Now, again, understanding it's not necessarily that, you don't want to be over reserved either. But I think especially we had a lot of conversation last year when we were balancing our budget. And I think, we considered, or people thought we should consider using more of our reserves to, keep some of the reductions we were making, but just from a long-term being able to balance and maintain. You cannot use reserves to maintain year-over-year expenditures. The only way you can do that is to build it into your tax levy. You cannot rely on reserves to fund recurring expenditures. They're really there for things that come up. We did use some of those COVID funds. We used some for some of our COVID funds last year, appropriate fund balance, but you do need to be very mindful that you cannot use it to pay for an existing program, because each year that'll need to be refunded, and then you diminish or you can deplete your reserves, and then you'll have another issue. Because if you think about it, every business has a savings account, and this is ours, and it is important, and they're tied to real liabilities, not that we actually do have to pay at one point or another. So right now we're projecting, again, this is very early on, but we are projecting a decrease in our fund balance year over year from last year to 8.7 million. And then if the trend continues and we're unable to replenish, we'll be really cutting significantly into that. And those are also important for a practical purpose too. It also helps us with our bond rating and our debt. And we are rated like companies are rated by Moody's, and we do receive a credit rating. And we also do use this money when we're waiting on our first infusion of revenues from the town of Greenberg on property taxes, which we do not get till October. And, in the meantime, when we don't have revenues coming in, we do use reserves to help us pay for our bills until those funds come in. And if we didn't have money here, we would actually have to borrow short-term borrowing, which also is an expense to the district. So there's a lot of practical and important reasons to not deplete these funds. But again, this is always a big, we always discuss this further in our further budget discussions.
And, as a summary, Maureen and I thought about sort of like, what are the things that are really essential to building, our school budget, and in terms of, principles and practices and philosophy with regards to, some of the things that we pay close attention to in that development process. First, zero-based budgeting and historical budgeting. So zero-based budgeting means that all the budget managers have to justify all of their expenses. So, they can't just create their budget sheets and hand them over to Maureen and say, this is what I want next year. So we have, lengthy conversations really going through, every, request, through every budget line that the budget managers put forth. And again, they're thinking strategically about, if I don't need this year on the basis of, the past, year, why increase it at that level? So, maybe it makes sense to decrease it. And maybe this is where you decrease it to build other programs. So that zero-based budgeting philosophy is really critical, as well as the historical budgeting. Which again is, we look at, what contracts or services we've used in the past, and how those, again, paying attention to making sure that they are economical, and also, provide us with a high level of service, so that we can continue to offer those supports and services that, we do a great deal of. Student assessment needs, or student needs, is a very critical part of what goes into the development of each year's budget. We look at what comes from, survey data, which, as we are administering school climate survey and an equity inclusion survey this week, starting tomorrow, with there's children in grades 6 through 12. And there's information that will come back from those surveys that the building leaders and others will have to consider with regard to the kinds of things that will support our students in some of the areas on the basis of the feedback that we receive. Attendance information is really essential. Performance information is really critical. If there's students who, for example, may not be doing so well in a particular, content area right now, we can't wait for them to fail. We have to make sure that it may mean that we hire an interventionist to provide some services for children. So that's something that, we pay close attention to. In a sense, we have a moral obligation to do so. We don't want children to languish and fail. We want them to, in the moment in which we find out that is happening, we need to take action. So that's such an important part of, what goes into budget development, is that philosophy that we are not going to sort of wait and have children, have to retake courses, but that we want to build in a way in which they happen, through this process. And the same applies to any of the special services that we have, services for students with IEPs. And if there's, a change and on the basis of a program review, we want to make sure that those adjustments are made, and that we may need to hire an additional teacher aide or teacher assistant or monitor or someone to provide some services on the basis of the needs of the child. So that's a huge part of budget development. You know that we rely upon demographic data that is collected every year. We will have class size data. That's very important. We use live birth data that we factor in. Certainly, we don't always know if we have new families moving in. Certainly, if they're not already in the school district participating in one of the preschool programs. So that information is really critical to building, and making sure we build into a budget additional staff members, if it's additional teacher on the basis of a change in class size. So that information is vital. As incoming kindergartners are a big part of, that whole process of determining how many sections we need, and then looking long term to see, when do those children, end up in 4th grade? What's the impact there, which we know then becomes an impact in 5th grade. So that's a major consideration. We talked about unfunded mandates. In a sense, any extras that were spent on the pandemic was an unfunded mandate. The only way to open schools was to be able to make sure we had the appropriate levels of custodial and cleaner professionals to do what they do, to go in and out of classrooms and clean surfaces and make sure that, everything is has been, taken care of, so that, we can, mitigate against, causing, anything internally leading to the cause or the spread of the virus. We certainly have seen the impact of needing to social distance in schools. Children don't social distance necessarily on their own. They need our help. So additional staff members are needed to make sure that that takes place, and to be around where students are, to help and assist them, to make sure that masks are worn. So it's probably one of the most significant unfunded mandates that we've actually had in a long time. But they do come through, and we do have to make sure that that our budgets reflect those. Any educational program development, as we mentioned earlier, special education is one of those areas, because it is a source of revenue. It can be a source of revenue, and that requires, though, an investment to make sure that those programs are attractive and run in such a way that other districts who do have children who can be served by those programs actually are looking to LAR and TESPA to bring children or enroll children into our school districts. So we definitely need to make sure that we're always paying attention to that we are servicing students with IEPs in such a way that if there is available space in those programs, we want to fill those with tuition paying students. Our facilities are super important, being able to make sure, that we provide for, if there's a need, certainly, with regards to, whether it's the return of first grade, if there needs to be some modifications, or if there needs to be just upkeep. More, these properties are a pretty significant asset to the community. And Joe, Maureen, and I were looking at that and thinking about how much, what is the dollar value of all these properties, and that, whether it be to replace sidewalks or, other, sorts of structural things that, have, through wear and tear over time need to be maintained. So that's always a big part of making sure we build that in, so that there is no sort of major surprise, as a result of us not, factoring in the need to make sure the properties are not only well maintained, but they're safe. Over the next, couple of months, we'll be talking about, the work to start the development of a portrait of a graduate, and that's, really looking at, the current context in terms of what the expectations are for success of our young people, in preparing them for life, work, and future learning, when so much has changed, not only from the standpoint of what we've learned from the pandemic around some of the really key competencies and skills and dispositions that young people need. We have to make sure that we align the internal system with the external expectations, and in the world of work, in college, in life, and that portrait of a graduate work will be the first phase of the work that starts in March, and the other half of that will start in July, which will be the lead in to the fall, which is that strategic planning process of the implementation process of the portrait of a graduate. And school districts are engaged in this work. I mean, they're not waiting to get out of this, but they're starting now, because so much of what we've had to do quickly with regards to a couple of the skills that we see that are really essential, like the notion of being adaptive and nimble, being able to change quickly, and being able to address and learn learn and acquire new skills so that you can apply them fairly quickly has certainly been something we've learned a lot about. Maureen's mentioned the employee contracts and benefits, that those change every year. Anytime there's a contract, there's an expectation of either changes in benefits, changes in salaries, or healthcare, TRS contributions, ERS contributions. All of those have to be factored in. And of course, whenever we do have a change in our among our employees, whether it's someone who retires or someone who goes on to another position in another district, we are looking not to bring that person in at that higher salary that they left with, but to bring them in at a salary commensurate with the region. We certainly can't bring in someone that is going to be paid a lot less than their neighboring districts. Well, in that case, we'll never really build up our employees if we don't maintain them and hire them and pay them at the rate that's acceptable in this region. So all of those are components that are factored into the development of this budget and every school budget, and from year to year, some of these components are even more important than others. So with that said, we have some time for some questions from you, and if you'd like to, I'll take us off of the share so that we can see who might be raising their hands to ask questions. Any hands raised?
Don't see any.
I tried to raise mine. Can you
Okay.
hear
Go right
me?
ahead.
Okay, sorry.
Yes, we see it.
Yes,
I'm in, post-hair situation here. Thanks for still being there, you guys. So my question is mainly, given all the parameters that you've laid out and, the budget year after year being even more difficult to balance, how are we going to go about weighing, if we need to hire a teacher in this department versus that department, or when you're saying there's some special ed needs, or there are maybe have needs for aides, and I'm wondering how we go about tallying, or I don't want to pit schools or departments against each other, so I know that's tricky, but how do we look at our curriculum in this sort of holistic way to say we know that this is the area that has to be tended to now?
One of the ways that, Maureen and I have been talking about, and obviously Melissa, is looking at, what the work that's about to start with the development of a portrait of a graduate. That's really the kind of North Star to guide us towards decisions about, what the priorities should be. So as we look at that, and that is a K-12 focus. So that is from the time the child enters the school system until the time they exit. And what's needed to develop that pathway for the youngsters so that when they do exit, they do have all the requisite, competencies and dispositions and, skills to be able to flourish in an environment where probably the jobs that they're going to have haven't yet been created. And the ability to be, nimble and adaptive is, a key. It's not just good to have, but it's essential to have, in order for, young people to function in this, ever changing world. Not even say attendance, but enrollment is one of those key factors that we look at. Like, where has there been a change or growth? And that is always a priority in terms of, whether there's a need for an additional teacher or a need for, an additional teacher assistant or aide or monitor. So those are the areas. And I think this, what we've seen since the start of the school year, and those places where we've had to add, those are those priorities are driven by need, and the data that we often reference is the enrollment data. That's a key driver always, and it becomes more aspirational when we look at this portrait of a graduate work, because then we are thinking really over the course of 13 years. It's a 13-year plan actually. From the time a child is in until they're out, and then the decisions that are made over the course of a number of years to plan for that, and to be able to articulate to the public, what's required in order to make that happen. So so it's a combination of those factors, the aspirational component, and then the student enrollment component, and the need to make sure that as we look at course taking, as we look at what it is that's needed to make sure that class sizes are reflect the belief of our community in our school system, that will also be a factor that we look at and that will drive our decisions.
Mm-hmm. And that we also have offerings that you're saying, and also to make sure that we have offerings that reflect the kind of graduates we're trying to put out in the world.
Exactly.
So it's a lot of balancing.
Okay. And I just want to say, I think part of what makes maybe people feel that there's that kind of pitting against each other is this trying to adhere to the tax cap, which by definition makes you have to cut something. Like if you build your budget based on your programs and your needs that exist, then like we're looking at it, we've sort of built a budget based upon it, like this is the number we can increase, and then everything has to anything that was being added had to be balanced by a reduction. So in building the budget too, I think we need to build our budget and then discuss it, what I mean, before just to have an understanding of this is what it would cost to have, and then because it isn't budgets years ago were built that way. And then with the post tax cap, they were built to fit into a number. And by doing so, sometimes, although not intentionally, maybe it felt as though we were pitting, because there's only so many dollars, right? So it's not, it is what it is. I think that's not so much, I don't think anybody here wants to do that, but then, decisions do have to be made, not because you only have so much, right? So I think, like Valerie said, it's also, I had said, years ago when there was enough at that time a strategic plan, much of it was your spending was then tied to what the, whether it be class size, whether it be program development, it was tied to the overall strategic plan. So then that also helps maybe prioritize certain spending or because it is tied to that overarching plan. And it's not just we're going to do, and not that that's how we do things anyway, but it may appear that way to people, but it really isn't that way. It's really more about the budgeting philosophy has to shift a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the other parts of that, has to do with, really making sure that, and every school system does this. Whenever someone retires, that's an opportunity. And as when people retire, they can retire anywhere in the system. And last year was one of those examples where there was a retirement at the middle school, which then led to, instead of us going out and rehiring a teacher, we looked at ways in which, on the basis of course taking, where there was a possibility of not, offering, an elective or replacing, someone who, or providing another section of some other, courses, what the decision there was, in order to not have to go out and hire a full-time teacher, it was a shift of one full-time earth science teacher to the middle school, which then, again, as I said, when we have to make those kinds of reductions, what happens is there is a domino effect, so someone loses out. There are some choices when when reductions are made, we can't offer everything. And that math never changes, if we're only relying upon our reductions to close or to balance our school budget. So that's a really tough, place, to be in a school district where we're only relying upon, who retires and on the basis of where they retire from. That may not be the best place, for that reduction. And that means that those budget managers have to make some shifts or adjustments. So that's a piece of this whole construct that really has to be, weighed carefully, because, it's our belief that, we can't, rely only upon reductions as our methodology for balancing the budget. The administrators, are just, are not even able to comprehend of what reductions they would put forth.
Yeah.
And
Maureen's point earlier, it will help when this is fleshed out more, to say, we may have to go up to this class size in these couple of grades if we do want to hire another teacher in this other area. There may be trade-offs that come down the pike that are hard to anticipate right at this moment until we see what people request.
And they will probably be in the wrong areas of the school system. And that's what I think our community sees when these decisions are made, that, depending upon where the retirement comes from, whether it's a position that's not replaced comes from, it makes it look like there's one section of the school system that, is getting more than the other. But the reality is it's where the retirement took place. If we're trying to reduce, you're going to take that savings from that retirement and then try to, as you said, Allison, consolidate classes or sections if that's possible. Or if you can't do that, you have to reduce other things. And so you have to cut electives. And so that is absolutely the reality of that led last year's budget, that we saw, that was almost $1 million worth of reductions, in a small system, with, almost 1,700 students. $1 million reduced is significant. And it was across the board. Every possible budget code and every budget manager was impacted. So, what we hope to lay as a new foundation for considering, not just reductions, but looking at, how much of a percentage above the tax cap, is the community willing to go, so that we don't decimate programs, so that we're not cutting places that we can't cut. who wants to have a, kindergarten of, 25 students or something ridiculous like that, or courses that are really important, in the middle school or the high school reduced because, we have no staff, no new staff to bring in, to keep those courses going.
Yeah.
And then the professional learning to even, bring in or grow new courses, new STEM courses and new opportunities for, for young people, like I could focus on computer science and, and coding and those classes that get children excited about artificial intelligence and, and that, the info technology, arena that, our that children are going to be functioning and operating in, and, and they can get really excited, while they're here in school, and therefore become, themselves, certainly, more prepared for what the world, expects them to do when they exit, as a senior and go out into the world.
Yeah.
I had a question, but we're over 7:30, so if we want to stop,
I mean, I feel bad. We went over, Toby.
all right, this is Toby.
Go ahead, Toby.
Go ahead.
And we can actually, you could say, oh, we're going to talk about this next time. You did mention a lot about class size, and I just was sort of thinking about, I wrote it down. You said, class size reflects belief of our system. So I was hoping we could have a discussion about class size and was looking forward to that happening. Could that happen? Will it happen? And sort of how would that happen if we wanted to have that discussion?
It'll happen in two places, Toby. As part of the January 14th Budget 101, we'll talk about class size, because we will be using that information for our actual budget presentations, that will start, January, February. So that's an important part of, the conversation around, what, the enrollment that we currently have and in the anticipation from live births with regards to who's coming in as a kindergartner. So that information will definitely play a role in, in this, in the early stages of the first few presentations that are made. So that information will be available.
Thanks. Okay, good.
Yeah, I think tonight we really were kind of focusing on the revenue side, and then, the next time we'll get more into those the class sizes and all those pieces, because of course that is a big piece of, as we look to put together our actual expenditure plan. And as Valerie said, we're still trying to understand, are we, out of the woods in terms of additional expenses related to COVID? So there's definitely a lot of, pieces that we're still trying to wrap our arms around that will have, a significant impact as we, put forth a spending plan, eventually, and get to that point in which, and each year, every year, I feel like I said that last year, but again, similarly this year, it's going to be a lot of conversation that's going to be needed, right? Because we already know that we're, even without adding things back that I think people would like to see, or increasing, or, need for additional teachers, we're going to, we're already over, so in order to even consider any of those things, that really needs to be, looked at how we spend our money, which is class sizes, class offerings, and programs primarily, right? Is the majority of our. I'm sorry. Hi, Jen.
I know you guys are over.
Yep.
But I have one question, and maybe there's no answer yet. But when you were talking about, COVID related expenses,
sure.
When I think about next year, I start to think and to be honest, worry a little bit about sort of how we're going to bridge some of the gaps, some of the academic gaps that COVID has created. And of course, with my more particular lens on special education. So when we think about, the special education budget and things like compensatory services and the summer program and, all the things that are potentially going to be needed and likely add cost and maybe just a year's worth of cost. I would hope if it's, done in a proactive way, it may just be a year. There's been missed services. How will the district assess where the kids are and what they're going to need to be able to know how to allocate the funds? for those sorts of things. And like I said,
So-
maybe there's not an answer yet.
Well, the sort of preamble to that was the screening information that Melissa Szymanski played a significant role in supporting the building leaders and the teachers, is gaining a sense of where children were in relationship to what happened in the spring. And so that information will definitely drive some of the decisions that will come out of the multi-tiered system of supports team, who will process that information and make determinations around what are some of the sorts of actions we can take now, whether it be to make sure that there's some additional after school opportunities for children. So rather than waiting for summer, which is not always easy, and also depending on what does happen, will we have the resources to maintain a summer program? So it's a matter of looking, as we've been doing now, looking at where children are and really emphasizing the MTSS process, so that we're not waiting for children to fail and not waiting to learn at some point later on in the school year that children, if we had done this and done it earlier, we would have prevented gaps from widening. So that's something that Melissa, can speak to, in addition to what I just shared. But that's the overall philosophy, is that we're in a different place than where we were in the spring. Children have a full day of instruction. It may be remote, or it could be the in-person. There's an effort through the screening data to identify, which children do need, who are, potentially struggling in a certain area or have some gaps somewhere. And that information then becomes actionable with regards to what the building leaders do with their MTSS teams. Anything to add to that, Melissa?
The only thing that is in addition that I would add is, following the first quarter and then looking across the different quarters for the remainder of the school year, I've also been meeting with the building leadership teams to see who's on their radar in terms of needing some additional support and who are they following. And that's also disaggregated by groups of students, and really thinking about our potentially more vulnerable learners and who's been on the radar. Not only who's been in the MTSS process, but also looking at that through the additional lens of local data around, quarterly report cards, and then looking at that a little bit more broadly in terms of how are students doing overall. So that process is also happening. So, at the more granular level, at the classroom level, students are being referred to MTSS. There are processes in place. And then at the district level, I've been meeting with the building administrative teams and doing some checks around where are we and who's on the radar, and what are we doing to support them? What are all the moving parts that are in play?
Okay.
Yeah.
I think we're ready to end this session. So we look forward to seeing you again on January 14th, where we will play out this methodology of, what does a balancing of a school budget look like when we're not only focusing on reduction. So we'll always have zero-based budgeting, which is that developing the rationale for what is needed from year to year to operate any particular program. But then what is that additional amount that, or a percentage that, will allow us not to have to reduce in the ways that we've reduced? And then, looking at, those opportunities to make sure that, we go into, the discussions, around really making sure that, we are being as frugal as we can, but not at the expense of programs and services that are available to children, and that make the school district attractive to the families who are here, who are already committed and moved in for those reasons, but then making sure that we don't cause those very same families to make sure to move out because class sizes are large, or there's that there's been some dramatic shifts. So we look forward to explaining that and laying out some scenarios for what those different options could look like. And then we also are going to show you what it would look like if we don't look at other methodologies, if we only still focus on reductions, like what exactly will that look like? Because we did show you a slide, where, that almost $1 million is $950,000 that, represented all of the reductions that had to be made to close our school budget. So we are going to show you, what it would mean, across the couple of years if we continue to only rely upon, cutting and reducing from the budget, as opposed to a combination of looking at, zero-based budgeting, that justification of what's in each code, plus, looking at how much or what percentage above the tax cap, would be tolerable, along with, what portions of the fund balance would then, be necessary. So, or when, under what conditions that would be necessary. So that, we show the sort of full spectrum of the potentials for balancing the school budget. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Maureen. Thank you, everybody, for showing up.
Thanks.
We'll see you.
Have a good evening.
Have a good evening.